Fog so thick you can see the edge of the road. A drop of 600 meters waiting on the other side of that fog. Freezing highland air giving way, kilometer by kilometer, to steaming jungle heat. One wrong turn of the wheel, and there is no barrier, no railing, nothing between you and the fall. And somewhere in the middle of the 20th century, a group of engineers looked at this mountainside and decided we'd build a highway here. Welcome back to the channel. Today we are looking at one of the most terrifying feats of road engineering ever attempted by human hands, the North Yungas Road in Bolivia. A route so notorious that almost nobody calls it by its real name anymore. Everyone just calls it Death Road, and for decades, that name was not an exaggeration. This is not just a road. It is a ledge carved into the side of the Andes, a strip of dirt and gravel clinging to a mountain wall, dropping from the freezing high plains all the way down into the steaming edge of the Amazon rainforest. It is a road that connects two completely different worlds, and it does so by hanging off the side of a cliff for over 60 kilometers. Picture the conditions. Elevation above 4,500 meters at the starting point, where the air is thin, breathing feels harder than it should, and the cold cuts through any jacket. Fog that rolls in without warning and swallows the road. Whole rain that turns dirt into mud and mud into a skating rink. Balanced above a canyon. Waterfalls that spill directly across the driving surface. Rock slides that can bury a lane in an instant. A road barely wide enough for a single vehicle in its narrowest stretches, forcing oncoming traffic to somehow pass each other on the edge of nothing. No guardrails, no barriers, no margin for error. And they decided to build a permanent transportation route through all of it. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive into the world's most extreme engineering projects. And stay with us until the end. Because the way this road forced engineers and drivers to rewrite the rules of the road itself is stranger than you'd expect. At first, there was only mountain, no pavement, no path, no markers. Just raw Andean slope falling away into cloud forest and jungle below. No settlements connected by anything more than footpaths and mule trails. Just rock, fog, and altitude, stacked on top of a vertical wilderness that separated the Bolivian highlands from the lowland region of the Yungas. If you tried to build a normal road here, cutting wide and gentle curves the way engineers do on flatter terrain, the mountains simply would not allow it. There was not enough stable ground to carve a wide two-lane route along most of the cliff face. If you tried to avoid the cliffs entirely and route the road around them, you would add enormous distance and cost, and you would still eventually have to cross the same unstable, steep terrain somewhere along the way. Every alternative ran into the same wall of rock and altitude. So the solution was not a modern, wide, guardrail-lined highway. It was something far more improvised. A narrow track cut directly into the mountainside, following the natural contours of the cliff, using whatever stable rock and slope the terrain offered, and asking drivers to adapt to the road rather than asking the road to adapt to modern safety standards. Let's walk through how this actually came together, from the first survey markers on an empty mountainside to the road that now carries cyclists instead of cargo trucks. The first step was understanding the terrain itself. Long before any construction began, the route had to be surveyed across some of the most difficult topography on the continent. Engineers and surveying crews had to trace a path down from the freezing pass near La Cumbre, through shifting fog banks, along exposed rock faces, and down into the warmer, wetter terrain near Coroaco. This was not a simple mapping exercise. Every kilometer of that descent presented a different prob, a different rock type, a different slope angle, a different risk of erosion, a different exposure to rain and mist. Why was this so difficult? Because the mountain doesn't hold still. Loose scree, saturated soil after rainfall, near vertical drops on one side and unstable overhangs on the other, made even walking the route dangerous, let alone mapping it for a road. Surveyors had to identify which sections of cliff could support a carved roadbed and which sections were too unstable to touch. Every ridge, every gully, every seasonal waterfall crossing had to be accounted for before a single shovel or pick could be used. How did they do it? Slowly, and largely by hand. Long stretches of the route were shaped using manual labor. The road was largely built in the 1930s, And a significant portion of that labor came from Paraguayan prisoners of war held after the brutal Chaco War. Picture that for a moment, men who had survived one of the deadliest conflicts in South American history put to work carving a ledge into an Andean cliff face, using hand tools against solid rock with no heavy machinery to speed the process along. The materials and tools involved in this early phase included stows, shovels, hand drills, dynamite for blasting through solid rock, wooden supports to shore up unstable cut faces, hand-pushed carts for hauling debris, ropes and harnesses for working on exposed slopes, makeshift scaffolding. This was not just a matter of picking the shortest line down the mountain. It was a matter of finding the only line the mountain would allow. Engineers had to reject dozens of tempting shortcuts because the rock underneath was too loose, too saturated, too likely to collapse under the weight of a loaded truck. A path that looked reasonable on a map could turn out to be built on nothing more than compacted mud, waiting for the next heavy rain to wash it away. So the survey process became a process of elimination, as much as discovery, ruling out one unstable slope after another, until only a single, narrow, imperfect route remained. Every ridge mattered, every gully mattered. A single overlooked seam of unstable rock, high above where the road would eventually run, could mean a landslide, burying the finished route years later. The surveyors were not just mapping a line on a mountain, they were trying to predict, decades in advance, which parts of that mountain would still be standing. Then came the actual roadbed itself. Once a viable line down the mountain had been identified, the real challenge began: carving a driving surface directly into the side of a cliff that in places dropped away almost vertically for hundreds of meters. This was to simply digging a trench. It was cutting a narrow shelf into rock and unstable slope, wide enough for a vehicle, angled correctly for drainage, and stable enough to survive the next rainy season. Why was this so hard? Because the road had almost no room for error in its dimensions. In its narrowest points, the finished route came out to only around 3 meters wide, barely enough for a single truck, let alone 2 vehicles attempting to pass each other. And because the terrain itself was constantly shifting, a stable roadbed one year could become an unstable one, the next undermined by erosion, saturated soil, or a fresh landslide. How did the builders manage it? By working section by section, blasting and carving where the rock allowed it, building up retaining walls of packed stone where the natural shelf was wide enough, and accepting a level of unevenness and imperfection that would never be tolerated on a modern highway. This was not engineering with a wide safety margin. This was engineering that used every available inch of stable ground and no more. The elements that had to be worked into this shelf-like roadbed included cut rock faces on the uphill side, unprotected drop-offs on the downhill side, hand-built retaining walls of stacked stone, natural drainage points to prevent water pooling, sections reinforced across directly over the road surface, curves tightened to follow the mountain's natural contour, occasional passing points where the road widened slightly, unpaved surfaces of packed dirt and gravel. This was not just carving a shelf into a mountain. This was carving a shelf into a mountain that actively fought back, a mountain that shed rock, funneled water, and shifted underfoot with every season. And yet, curve by curve, the shelf grew longer. Blast a section, clear the debris, pack the fill, reinforce the edge, move to the next curve, and repeat for kilometer after kilometer, year after year, until a single continuous ledge connected the highlands to the lowlands for the first time in the region. Is history. Then came the descent itself, the part of the road that makes it famous. The road drops from cold, thin-aired highlands above 4,500 kilometers, 4,500 meters, down to warm, humid lowlands near Coroico at roughly a tenth of that altitude. That is an elevation change of somewhere around 3,500 meters, compressed into a route roughly 60 to 70 kilometers long. Few roads on the planet ask a vehicle to change environments this dramatically in such a short distance. Why was this section so uniquely dangerous? Because the road was just narrow. It was narrow while also curving constantly along a cliff edge, with drops that in the steepest sections reach around 600 meters straight down. There was no room to build a full 2-lane road along most of this stretch. Instead, the engineers accepted a single narrow lane shared in both directions. which meant vehicles traveling in opposite directions had to somehow negotiate passing each other on a ledge with a sheer drop on one side. And the climate didn't cooperate either. Near the top of the route, close to the Highland Pass, the air is thin, cold, and frequently wrapped in fog dense enough to blind a driver to anything more than a few meters ahead. Descend far enough, and that same road pushes into warm, humid, tropical conditions near Coroico, thick with cloud forest vegetation pressing in from both sides. A single trip down this road meant crossing through nearly every climate zone the region had to offer, all while navigating the same narrow, unguarded ledge the entire way. How did they solve a problem that could be solved by widening the road? They changed the rules of driving itself. On this road, and only on this road in all of Bolivia, traffic drives on the left-hand side instead of the right. Why? Because it puts the downhill driver, the one whose wheels are closest to the edge, in the driver's seat closest to that edge, giving them a direct view of exactly how close their tires are to the drop. The uphill driver, further from the edge, has to trust the other driver's judgment. It's a strange, elegant, low-tech solution to a problem that no amount of concrete could fully fix. The road needs the driver's judgment. The driver's judgment needs a clear view of the edge. A clear view of the edge needs a rule strong enough to override every driving habit a person has ever known. That is what the left-hand driving rule really is. Not a quirk, but a chain of dependencies. Each link installed to compensate for the one weakness the engineers could never fully design away: the narrowness of the road itself. Imagine sitting behind the wheel on that outer lane. For the first time, tires just inches from where the road simply stops and the mountain falls away into fog. You cannot see the bottom of the drop. You can only see where your own front tire meets gravel. And beyond that, nothing. Every meter you creep forward, you are trusting a rule written decades ago by people who understood, better than anyone, exactly how thin the margin for error really was. Then came the systems that had to support this fragile, extreme route once it was carrying regular traffic. A road like this does just need a driving surface. It needs an entire support system layered around that surface to keep it functional through decades of rain, fog, and landslides. That support system includes drainage cuts designed to channel rainwater off the roadbed before it could pool and weaken the surface. The formal maintenance crews responsible for clearing landslide debris after storms. Small shrines and roadside memorials marking the sites of past. URC markers at the most dangerous curves, sections of road atinda bis, the seed and bud and Fort Dainchies. Every curve mattered. Every meter of width mattered. On a road with a margin for error measured in centimeters rather than meters. There was no small mistake. There was only a mistake or no mistake at all. The road needs the driver's caution. The driver's caution needs local knowledge. Local knowledge needs generations of drivers surviving long enough to pass it on. Break any link in that chain, and the road claims another vehicle. None of these systems were the kind you'd find in a modern engineering manual. There was no central authority pouring concrete barriers or installing reflective signage every few hundred meters. Instead, the road rail safety system was distributed, spread across the memory of drivers who had made the trip 100 times before. Across the informal etiquette that grew up around passing on blind curves. Across the simple, brutal lesson that every accident taught the drivers who came after. This was not a road maintained by an agency so much as a road survived by a community. This was not just a transportation route. This was a shared, unwritten agreement between every person who drove it. An agreement that said, slow down here, honk before that curve, never trust the fog, and never ever assume the other driver has seen you first. This is why for decades this route carried a reputation that few roads on Earth can match. It was named the world's most dangerous road by the Inter-American Development Bank in 1995, an institutional official label placed on a route that local drivers had already feared for generations. Historical estimates suggest that during its peak years, as the primary route between La Paz and the Yungas region, the road claimed somewhere in the range of 200 to 300 lives every year, buses going over the edge, trucks losing traction on wet curves, vehicles meeting each other on blind corners with nowhere to go but down. Imagine driving this road for the first time Fog rolling across the windshield so thick you can see 10 meters ahead. The wheels on your side of the vehicle inches from a drop that disappears into cloud below. A truck coming the other way, its driver leaning out the window, guiding his own tires along the crumbling edge. Both of you negotiating who moves first on a ledge with no room for hesitation. This was not a rare unlucky day on this road. This was every single trip. This was not just dangerous. This was a road that demanded absolute, unbroken concentration for hours at a time, with death waiting for the smallest lapse. And it was to only cars and trucks that made this journey, for decades. This was also the route for buses packed with passengers, families traveling between the highlands and the Yungas region for work, for trade, for visits home. Every one of those trips meant ordinary people, not thrill seekers, not tourists placing their lives in the hands of a driver navigating a single-lane cliffside track in the rain, in the fog, in the dark. There was no other way to make the journey. The road was to a choice. It was the only door between two parts of the same country. Without an alternative route, communities on both ends of the road had no option but to accept the risk as the price of staying connected to markets, to family, to medical care, to each other. With every trip that ended safely, the road earned a little more trust it never fully deserved. With every trip that didn't, the road earned its name a little more permanently. Every road, even one built with hand tools and dynamite instead of modern machinery, eventually has to prove itself against the one force no engineer can fully control: time. Rain came every wet season and tested every retaining wall. Fog came almost every morning and tested every driver's memory of the curves ahead. Trucks, overloaded far beyond what the narrow shelf was ever meant to carry, tested every meter of the road's edge. Year after year, decade after decade, there was no formal inspection process the way a modern highway department would run one. The real inspection was simply whether the road was still there the next morning, and whether the vehicles that used it the day before had made it to the other end. This was not just a road that had to be built once. This was a road that had to survive being built over and over again, every single rainy season. For the better part of a century, where the old fill gave way, workers packed in new fill. Where a retaining wall crumbled, someone rebuilt it with whatever stone was closest at hand. Where a curve narrowed further after a landslide, drivers simply learned to slow down even more at that exact spot. And word passed from one driver to the next. Then came the moment the road's story changed completely. By the early 2000s, Bolivia's government recognized what decades of accidents had already proven: this route could not keep functioning. The solution was to widen or reinforce the old road. It was to build an entirely new one. A modern paved bypass route was constructed on a different alignment, designed with modern engineering standards, wider lanes, proper drainage, and none of the single-lane cliffside compromises that defined the old Yungas road. Why couldn't they simply upgrade the existing road instead? Because the old route's fundamental problem was to neglect its geometry. The narrow ledge carved into the cliff face in the 1930s had no room to be widened into a modern two-lane road without essentially rebuilding it from scratch along a different, more stable path. Fixing the old road properly meant, in effect, building a new one. This meant surveying an entirely new corridor through the same brutal terrain, choosing a route with wider, more stable ground, engineering proper drainage instead of hand-dug channels, laying real pavement instead of packed dirt and gravel, installing barriers where the old road had none, and building two lanes wide enough that vehicles could pass each other without anyone needing to lean out a window. It meant applying essentially everything that modern road engineering had learned in the decades since the original route was carved, decades the old road had been forced to operate without. This was not just a road project, this was an admission. Decades in the making that the original solution, carving a single narrow shelf into unstable rock and asking generations of drivers to compensate with caution. It had only ever been the best option available with the tools, funding and terrain of the 1930s. A modern country, with modern engineering, finally had the means to do better. The new paved route was completed and opened in the mid-2000s, commonly dated to around 2006 to 2007. Almost overnight, the old cliffside road lost its role as the primary transportation corridor. Trucks, buses, and everyday traffic shifted onto the new highway, and the death toll on the old road dropped sharply because the vehicles that once had no choice but to risk it now had somewhere else to go. Without the new road, the old one would still be claiming lives at the same brutal rate today. With it, the old road was finally allowed to become something else entirely. Every kilometer of new highway that opened meant one less kilometer of the old cliffside gamble that families had to take. Every switchback rebuilt with proper width and drainage on the new route meant one less blind curve where two vehicles might meet with nowhere to go. This was not just a new road. This was an entire region finally being given a choice it had never had before. The choice to travel between the highlands and the lowlands without staking a life on it every time. Then came its strange second life. Freed from being a necessity, the old youngest road became something almost nobody would have predicted for a route built by prisoners of war on the side of an Andean cliff. A tourist attraction, extreme mountain bikers began riding the old route by choice, drawn by the same terrifying descent that once killed drivers who had no other option. Today, cyclists cover roughly the same elevation change from freezing highland air down to warm lowland jungle, but on two wheels with helmets, support vehicles, and guides who know every dangerous curve by name. Think about how strange that shift really is. For most of its history, this road was something people endured because they had no alternative, a risk accepted out of necessity. Not desire buses that once carried terrified passengers past sheer drops now sit replaced by a modern highway, a mountain range away. And in their place, people from all over the world now pay to experience, voluntarily, and for a few adrenaline-soaked hours, the exact same descent that once represented a life for all's. What was once a burden carried out of necessity has become an experience sought out for the thrill of it. The road itself did not change to make this possible. The cliffs are the same cliffs. The fog still rolls in the same way it always has. The drop is still there, waiting past the edge of the gravel, exactly as steep as it was when trucks and buses were the ones navigating it. What changed was the reason people travel it, and, just as importantly, the fact that they now have a choice. Local guides now lead groups down the old route on a regular basis, pointing out the same curves that once claimed vehicles, the same waterfalls that still cross the road surface, the same drop-offs that still carry no railing at all. What was once purely a danger to be survived has become, strangely, a story, to be told one curve at a time to anyone willing to ride a bicycle along the edge of it. Most visitors who ride this road today only see the surface of what it represents. They see the fog, the cliffs, the thrill of the descent, and the photographs at the bottom to prove they survived it. They do not see the decades of accidents that gave the road its name. They do not see the labor of the workers who carved this ledge into solid rock by hand, without machinery, at extreme altitude. They do not see the families who lost loved ones to a single missed curve. Before the new highway ever existed, they do not see the quiet decision, made by engineers and officials to finally route the country's traffic somewhere safer. They do not see the road's slow transformation from a lifeline that killed people into a monument that people now visit specifically because it once did. They do not see the fog that once erased the entire road from view for drivers who had no choice but to keep moving. Anyway, they do not see the buses that once carried entire families along the same narrow ledge, with no alternative route waiting for them, a mountain range away from above. In a drone shot or a satellite photo, the road looks almost delicate, a thread stitched along the contour lines of the mountain, but down at wheel height, on the actual gravel, with the drop just past your shoulder, it has never once felt delicate to the people who had to cross it from above. On a clear day, the road looks almost peaceful, a thin brown line traced along green mountainside, disappearing into cloud forest below. But below that surface, impression is a route shaped by prisoners of war, by decades of preventable tragedy, and by an entire country's decision that some roads are too dangerous to keep using. No matter how important they once were, this road was not just a route between two cities. It was a test of what human beings will attempt when there is no other way through. This was not just dangerous engineering. It was necessary engineering, born from a landscape that offered no gentler option. And this was not just a road that killed people. It was a road that eventually taught an entire nation something about the cost of convenience built without enough margin for safety. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this road still exists at all. It would have been simple enough to close it entirely once the new highway opened, to let the old ledge crumble back into the mountainside, unmaintained, forgotten, reclaimed by fog and vegetation. Instead, it stayed open, repurposed, its danger turned into its main attraction. The same cliffs that once represented a country-only option now represent a choice people make on purpose. For a few hours, before returning to a much safer road for the rest of their journey. The mountains did not move to make room for this road. The road was forced to fit itself into the mountains, curve by narrow curve, cliff by unguarded cliff, for as long as it had to. And when a safer path finally became possible, that old road did not disappear. It stayed, as a narrow strip of history bolted to the side of the Andes, still fogged in most mornings, still dropping away into nothing on one side, still reminding anyone who travels it exactly what it costs to connect two very different worlds separated by one very unforgiving. Think about what it actually took to get here. Decades of manual labor against solid rock, much of it performed by men who had already survived a war before they ever picked up a shovel on this mountainside. Generations of drivers who learned the road's dangers the only way anyone could, by driving it, curve after blind curve, and hoping the fog lifted in time. An entire unwritten system of trust between strangers meeting each other on a ledge 3 meters wide, negotiating who moves first, with nothing but a honk of the horn and a glance out the window. And finally, a government decision made only after decades of accumulated loss to build something safer somewhere else and let this road become a memory instead of a necessity. Every one of those decades mattered. Every one of those drivers mattered. Every curve that held and every curve that eventually gave way became part of the same long story. The story of a country refusing to let a mountain range keep two of its regions permanently apart, no matter what that connection would eventually cost. This was a promise made in the 1930s and kept imperfectly and at enormous human cost for the better part of a century. This was not just a dangerous road. This was proof of exactly how far people will go and how much they will risk when the alternative is staying cut off from the rest of their own country. And this was not just a mountain that got a road cut into its side. This was a mountain that for decades quietly decided how many of the people crossing it would make it to the other end. Until finally it didn't have to decide that anymore. Somewhere on that old road today, a group of cyclists is probably rolling down through the fog right now, brakes squealing on the same gravel that trucks once fought for traction, on laughing nervously at a drop that used to be measured in lives lost, rather than photographs taken. The mountain has forgotten what this road used to cost. It has simply, finally, been allowed to stop collecting. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most extreme roads ever built, subscribe to the channel for more engineering stories from the edges of what's possible, from mountain passes to jungle rivers to deserts that swallow entire highways whole. Thank you for watching.